June 7th, 2003, Anaheim, California. It's Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Finals. The cup is in the building, and everyone, from the broadcasters in the booth, to the fans in the stands, to the millions tuned in at home, are all watching on, hoping that they'll get to witness a piece of hockey history. What no one expects is just how it would happen. But let's back up a bit. Beginning play during the 1993-94 season, the Anaheim Mighty Ducks started their life in the NHL rather timidly. Like most expansion franchises, the early years were mostly spent towards the bottom, the first steps of building towards contention with flashes of success. They only made the playoffs twice from their inception through 2002, and while they did have a series win to their name, true success hadn't quite followed them yet. The 2003 team, on paper, looked as if it was going to follow a similar trajectory. They had a competitive team, one good enough to make the playoffs to be sure, but not necessarily one that stood out as elite. That didn't stop their ragtag group, however, from locking down second in their division and the 7th seed in the West, and they did so by managing to squeeze out performance from up and down the lineup. With guys like Peter Sikora and Adam Oates leading the way, the mid-season acquisition of Rob Niedermeyer adding a spark to the roster, and a career year from goaltender Jean-Sébastien Giguère, it was turning into a very successful season for the Ducks. And it was all led by their captain, Paul Kariya. Now, Kariya was ahead of his time. Standing at 5'10", 180 pounds, he was pretty undersized for the time, and as such relied more on his skating ability and creativity with the puck to provide offense. Now sure, small skilled forwards are a dime a dozen nowadays, but back in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were seen as taboo. See, this was the height of the dead puck era, an era defined by strong physical play and heavy defenses. Even some of the best offensive players of the era weren't shy about throwing their weight around when it was needed. So having a guy whose game was completely different to the style of the time stood out in all the wrong ways. Despite all of this, Kariya's offensive talent couldn't be understated. Throughout his time in Anaheim, he'd lead the team in scoring by a pretty significant margin. He'd reached the 30-goal mark 6 separate times, 3 of which even broke the 40-goal plateau, and in the seasons where he played all 82 games, he'd only dropped below 80 points once, and even broke the 100-point threshold in 96 and 99. But that's the thing. In the first 9 years of his career, he only managed a full 82-game season on 4 separate occasions. Due to the style he played and the era in which he played in, Kariya would more often than not find himself the target of most of the enforcers he'd face. And with officiating also being more lenient during that time, it wasn't long before Kariya found himself on the wrong side of a questionable hit. And for whatever reason, those hits always seemed to end up on his head. Whether it was his size, the fact that guys didn't like him skating around so easily, or a mix of both, who knows. What we do know is that due to the reckless nature of those hits, Kariya would suffer from multiple concussions throughout his career. The most infamous of which up to that point came in 1998 when Gary Suter caught him with a cross-check squarely in the head. As a result, he'd be forced to miss the remainder of the season, and more importantly, the 1998 Nagano Olympics. A disappointment he still carries with him to this day. Now maybe it was the momentum from a full 82-game season for the captain, or maybe it was good karma finally catching up to him. But heading into the 2003 playoffs, everything finally seemed to be going right for the Ducks. They managed to squeeze out gritty, hard-fought wins over the Red Wings and Stars, with each victory being decided by no more than a single goal. It set them up for the conference finals, in which they'd be met by another underdog in the Minnesota Wild, where Giguère had one of the most legendary performances in league history, as in a 4-game sweep he'd allowed just 1 goal en route to their first finals appearance in franchise history. The team had endured a lot in their short time in the league, their captain more so than most. But throughout those playoffs, it felt like they were a team of destiny, one ready to shake off the disappointments of the past and take a step into a new era of success. And with how well they were playing, heading into those finals, they truly felt like an unstoppable force. So let's meet our removable object. During this era, the New Jersey Devils weren't just one of the best teams in the NHL. They were the defining example of excellence for the better part of a decade. Is that an exaggeration? Maybe, but it wouldn't be much of one. From 1994 through 2002, they'd make the finals on 3 separate occasions, and would come out victorious twice. Their trip here in 2003 was particularly notable as it was their 3rd appearance in just 4 years. But despite all the division championships and deep playoff runs, that wasn't the way they'd make their mark on the league. Remember earlier when I called this the dead puck era? Yeah, these guys were why. Head coach Jacques Lemaire would pioneer a new defensive style of play dubbed the neutral zone trap. It worked by having one player press at the opposing blue line and having the rest sit back to defend their own. Basically, clog up the middle and either force a turnover or an ineffective dump in that could easily be collected. What this did was that it basically shut down any attempt at offense before it could even start. For proof of its effectiveness, just look at their conference finals matchup with the Ottawa Senators. They'd hold the President's Trophy winners and league's third best offense to less than 2 goals per game across the 7-game series, which included holding their vaunted right side of Daniel Alfredsson, Marian Hossa, and Martin Havlat to just 8 points combined. For as effective as the trap was, a system is only as good as the players tasked with executing it. Sure, they did have offensive talent with guys like Patrick Elias, Jamie Langenbrunner, Scott Gomez, and Joe Nieuwendyk, but this team's success was built on their back end. Their big names being arguably the best goaltender of all time in Martin Brodeur, as he was getting sheltered by Scott Niedermayer, Brian Rafalski, Oleg Tverdovsky, and Ken Daneyko, and it was all led by their captain, Scott Stevens. Now, if Kariya was the outlier of the era, then Stevens was the gold standard, the prime example of the physical style that dominated at the time. If I were to make a modern-day comparison, just imagine if Matt Rempe was a top 4 defenseman. Even then, looking at just the numbers doesn't really speak to Stevens' game. They're decent, don't get me wrong, but his production was always a secondary part to his game. Standing at 6'2", 215, Stevens eventually grew to become one of the best hitters in the league, particularly in open ice. Cutting across the middle against the Devils in that era usually meant running headfirst into one of the most feared shoulders in league history. And that is, unfortunately, not an exaggeration. Because of the style he played, Stevens would tend to toe the line between acceptable and dirty hits, and would even cross it on several occasions. His most infamous hit up to that point was the one on Eric Lindros in the 2000 Eastern Conference Finals. The concussion Lindros suffered caused him to miss the entirety of the next season, and the long-term effects meant that he was never the same player afterwards. This, unfortunately, was an all-too common sight with Stevens, and was part of why he was so feared. So when you combine the physicality that he brought with the rugged system the Devils had employed to great success, then it's safe to say that heading into those finals, the Ducks were swimming downstream right towards a trap they couldn't avoid. And after the first 2 games, it certainly looked like it. With back-to-back shutouts at home, New Jersey's system seemed to be humming along to perfection, with the Ducks being unable to break through the trap and get their game going. And it continued back in Anaheim. But with the crowd on their side, they managed to eke out 2 straight wins in overtime to even the series. But then in what was easily the most uncharacteristic win of their season, the Devils' offense would come up large as they rode out 6-3 winners at home in Game 5 to put the series on the brink. The script seemed to be playing out exactly as expected, the underdogs being held at bay to the favored veterans. And now heading back home with the season on the line, the Ducks would have to find some sort of breakthrough to force the series back to New Jersey. June 7th, 2003, Anaheim, California. Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Final. Knowing that the season could end tonight, Anaheim knew they had to come out strong. And they did. With 3 goals in the first, it looked like the Ducks had finally gotten to their game. Using their speed to outnumber the Devils on the counter and get in behind the forecheck, it showed that they finally figured out how to get through the trap. A bit of puck luck helping out for good measure. But you couldn't count out the Devils just yet. They'd shown that they had the offense in them already, and they'd hoped that a quick goal early in the second would help swing the momentum back in their favor. But it didn't quite do that. They still needed another spark, one to get them back on their game, and one that would hopefully throw Anaheim off theirs. And for Stevens, he knew that a big hit can sometimes help swing games the same way as a goal or a big save could. So he went out looking for a target. And he knew just who to get. 6 minutes into the second, off the turnover caused by Gomez, Kariya would pick up the puck. After cutting in the middle, he'd dish off to Sikora as he entered the zone. And like so many before him, Stevens was there to meet him. After the hit, Kariya lost consciousness for a few seconds, and as he laid on the ice, everyone began to fear the worst. He struggled to get to his feet, nearly falling as he did so, and as he headed to the locker room, you could feel a sense of dread. Kariya's season looked to be over, and Anaheim's lead began to look a lot more fragile. Even if they held on, they'd have to go back to New Jersey, and without their captain, it made an already daunting task look that much worse. But not even 5 minutes later, Kariya was back on the ice, and the mood began to change. What happened next was nothing short of spectacular.
Man rushes are piling up. The Devils with 5 odd-man rushes, none for Anaheim. Into the zone, Sakura kicked it out, got it back near side Kariya. Kariya, the fans want one. Off the floor! On the board! Paul Kariya!
In interviews years later, Kariya admitted that due to the injuries he sustained, he didn't remember much of Game 6. Not the hit, not the goal. In fact, his injuries were so severe, he didn't remember much of Games 5 or 7 either. Maybe that was for the best, as despite Anaheim's best efforts, ultimately it didn't matter, as they were shut out again and would lose Game 7 back in New Jersey. The only consolation prize being that for his efforts, Giguere did win the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP. The hollow victory, to be sure. It wasn't all bad though, as Anaheim would learn from their experience, and just a few years later, they'd make it back to the finals, and this time they'd get the job done. With arguably one of the best rosters in NHL history, Giguere was now joined by the additions of Teemu Selanne, Chris Pronger, a young Chris Kunitz, Corey Perry, and Ryan Getzlaf. Hell, they even brought over Scott Niedermayer from New Jersey's successes as well. Ironically, their cup win also coincided with Stevens' induction into the Hockey Hall of Fame. But getting back on track here, what about Kariya? How does he fit in all of this? And was he a part of that 2007 team that won it all? In probably the cruelest twist in our entire story, that goal would actually be the last he'd ever score in a Ducks uniform. Due to budget restrictions the next year, the team wasn't able to retain him at the salary he would have commanded, and so he'd walked that offseason and signed with Colorado in free agency. A few more stops in Nashville and St. Louis would follow, but the playoff success never did, and Kariya would never make it back to the finals. And after suffering another concussion in 2009, the 6th of his career, the writing was on the wall. He'd play his final game in the NHL at the end of the 2010 season and officially retire in the summer of 2011, forever one game short of the ultimate prize. Kariya would step away from the game in the years afterwards, disillusioned by how it affected his life and his health. And who could blame him? In his own words, he was bitter. He was a creative player who had his biggest asset constantly taken away, while also being at the mercy of a league that didn't do much in the way of protecting him. All that before mentioning how guys like Suter and Stevens have never reached out or apologized for what they did and how it affected his life going forward. But for as much as Kariya didn't want to be associated with hockey, it's safe to say that hockey owes him a lot. Without him showcasing the effectiveness of his style, we wouldn't have had guys like Patrick Kane, Johnny Gaudreau, or Cole Caulfield. Without him pioneering hockey in the South, we may have never seen the Ducks reach championship success, or the success of other teams like Florida, Tampa, or Vegas. Without him, concussions and other hand injuries wouldn't be taken as seriously or with as much care as they are today. Kariya's legacy, as unfair as it may be, will forever be tied to that goal. Looking at it in retrospect, it's a fascinating blend of everything that makes the sport so beloved. The physicality, the skill, the unwavering dedication, and making sure that no matter how hard you get hit, to always get back up. Regardless of the outcome, Kariya's goal remains in the hearts of hockey fans everywhere, a lasting image from a bygone era as it transitioned towards the one we know today. And while he may have fallen just short of seeing his name etched in NHL history, on that night in Anaheim, he wrote his name forever into hockey legend.